The morning sun cast long shadows across the wheat fields of Colony 7, where Rose Miller stood at the edge of her family's farm. Her eyes were fixed not on the golden crops swaying in the breeze, but on the distant sky, where military ships occasionally passed overhead. At 19, she was tall and strong from years of farm work, with calloused hands and determination in her eyes. "You're wasting your time again," her older brother Tom called out from behind the harvester. "Those ships aren't going to magically sweep you away to the academy." Rose ignored him, just as she ignored most people who doubted her dreams. She had spent the last 3 years studying in secret, preparing for the Galactic Defense Academy's entrance exams. While others slept, she trained her body and mind, knowing that this was her only chance to escape the limited future that Colony 7 offered. The colony's small community center buzzed with whispers when Rose submitted her application to the academy. The locals gathered at Jack's diner that evening, their conversations filled with mockery and disbelief. "A farmer's daughter in the academy?" Old Mr. Peters laughed, slapping his knee. "They'll send her back before the first week is over." But Rose had done something no one expected. She scored in the top percentile of the entrance exams. The results arrived on a crisp morning, lighting up her personal tablet with news that would change her life. Her parents stood in their modest kitchen, their faces a mixture of worry and pride. "Rose, honey," her mother said softly, "the academy isn't for people like us. The inner system families, they've been training their children since birth." "Then they won't see me coming," Rose replied, her voice steady and confident. The journey to the academy took 3 days by transport ship. Rose spent most of it studying the orientation materials, memorizing every detail about the institution that had existed for over 200 years. The massive space station that housed the academy came into view like a steel giant against the stars, its training rings spinning slowly to maintain artificial gravity. The welcome ceremony was everything Rose had imagined and feared. 500 new cadets stood in the grand hall, most wearing expensive clothes that marked them as children of military families or wealthy merchants. Rose's simple colony clothes made her stand out like a weed in a garden of roses. During the initial assessments, the prejudice became clear. Despite her test scores, the combat instructor, Lieutenant Wade, barely glanced at her performance charts. "Colony stock," he muttered, marking her file. "Basic combat class. You'll be better suited there." Rose found herself assigned to the lowest combat training level, surrounded by cadets who had barely passed the entrance requirements. The other students whispered behind her back, making bets on how long she would last. "I give her a week," one cadet said loudly enough for her to hear. "That's generous," another replied. "Look at her, probably never seen a real weapon in her life." What they didn't know was that Rose had spent years defending her family's crops from wild animals that had adapted to Colony 7's high gravity. She had developed reflexes and strength that even she didn't fully understand yet. That night, in her small dormitory room, Rose sat on her bed and looked out at the endless space beyond the station's windows. She took out her tablet and began studying the academy's training protocols, looking for any advantage she could find. Her roommate, a quiet girl named Beth from another farming colony, watched her with curiosity. "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" Beth asked. Rose nodded without looking up. "I'm not here to prove them wrong," she said firmly. "I'm here because this is where I belong." As lights out was called and the dormitory fell silent, Rose made a promise to herself. She would show them all that where you came from didn't determine where you could go. The academy had never seen anyone like her, and they weren't ready for what she would become. The academy's training hall echoed with the sound of combat boots hitting the polished floor as cadets ran their morning drills. Rose moved through the exercises with ease, her body already adjusted to the grueling routine after 3 weeks of training. What her classmates didn't realize was that she had been up since 400 hours, practicing alone in the auxiliary gym. During a standard gravity adjustment test, something unexpected happened. While other cadets struggled with the increasing pressure, Rose maintained her form perfectly. Lieutenant Wade watched with narrowed eyes as she completed the exercise without breaking a sweat. "Stop," he commanded, approaching her station. "Miller, what's your home colony's gravity rating?" 1.8 standard, sir," Rose answered, standing at attention. The lieutenant's expression changed slightly. Colony 7's higher gravity had given Rose an advantage she hadn't even realized she had. Her muscles and bones were naturally stronger than those of her peers from standard gravity worlds. Later that day, as Rose practiced alone in the auxiliary gym, she heard footsteps behind her. Commander Gray, an older man with steel-gray hair and a legendary reputation in special operations, stood watching her. "Your form is wrong," he said simply, "but your instincts are interesting." Rose straightened up, unsure whether to feel insulted or honored by his presence. Commander Gray was known for rarely interacting with first-year cadets. "Show me how you would defend against a charging attacker on your colony," he said. Rose demonstrated the sideways dodge and low tackle she had used against charging herbivores in the wheat fields. The commander watched with increasing interest. "Meet me here at 400 tomorrow," he said before walking away. "Don't be late." The next morning began a new routine. Commander Gray taught Rose how to combine her colonial survival techniques with military combat forms. He showed her how to use her high-gravity strength to her advantage, developing moves that would surprise opponents who relied on traditional training. "The mistake most cadets make," he explained one morning, "is thinking that military combat is about following a rulebook. Real fighting is about adaptation." Rose's classmates noticed the changes in her performance. During team exercises, she moved differently than everyone else, her reactions quicker, her strategies unexpected. The wealthy inter-system students who had mocked her began to whisper new rumors. "I heard she's getting special training," one cadet said during lunch. "Probably cheating somehow," another responded. Colony rats always try to game the system. But Rose didn't care about their words anymore. She focused on her training, pushing herself harder each day. Commander Gray's lessons went beyond physical combat. He taught her about strategy, about reading opponents, about using their assumptions against them. One morning, during a particularly intense training session, Rose finally asked the question that had been bothering her. "Sir, why are you helping me?" Commander Gray paused, studying her for a moment. "Because 20 years ago, I was you, another colony kid everyone underestimated. The Academy needs different perspectives, different experiences. We just need someone to prove it." The training continued, getting more intense each week. Rose learned to combine the patience she had developed watching over crops with the explosive speed needed for combat. She discovered that her experience dealing with unpredictable colony weather had taught her to adapt quickly to changing situations. During a standard class exercise, Rose's new skills caught Lieutenant Wade's attention. She took down 3 opponents using a combination of traditional moves and colony-adapted techniques. The lieutenant watched with a mixture of surprise and reluctance as she helped her defeated opponents up, showing the same courtesy she'd been denied weeks before. That evening, a notice appeared on Rose's tablet. She had been promoted to advanced combat classes, effective immediately. As she packed her gear to move to a new training group, Beth gave her a genuine smile. "You're really doing it," Beth said. "You're actually changing things around here." Rose looked at her packed bag and then at the training schedule for her new classes. "This is just the beginning," she replied, a quiet confidence in her voice. "Wait until they see what's next." The Advanced Combat Training Hall was twice the size of the basic facility, filled with state-of-the-art simulation equipment and training zones. Rose stood with her new classmates, aware of the skeptical glances thrown her way. These were the Academy's elite students, and they didn't welcome outsiders. "Today's exercise will test your tactical thinking," Lieutenant Wade announced. "The simulation will present multiple hostile targets. Your goal is to neutralize all threats while minimizing damage to yourself and the environment." Rose stepped into the simulation chamber, her heart steady. The virtual environment materialized around her, a complex urban setting with multiple levels and hidden corners. As the simulation began, she didn't rush forward like her predecessors had done. Instead, she crouched low, using the techniques she'd learned from stalking crop raiders back home. Her movements were silent, efficient. The first virtual enemy never saw her coming. She disabled it using a modified version of the holds she'd used to pin down escaped livestock. Interesting approach, Lieutenant Wade muttered, watching the monitors. The other students gathered around the observation screens, their initial dismissal turning to curiosity as Rose moved through the simulation. She used walls and corners differently than they'd been taught, treating them as natural barriers like the rock formations on Colony 7. When 3 hostiles appeared simultaneously, Rose didn't panic. She remembered Commander Gray's lessons about using an opponent's momentum against them. With quick, precise movements, she positioned herself so the virtual enemies interfered with each other's attack paths. "That's not standard protocol," one student whispered. "But it's working," another replied, leaning forward to watch more closely. Rose completed the simulation with the highest score of the day. The usual chatter in the training hall had died down to a stunned silence. Lieutenant Wade checked the scores twice before making the announcement. "Miller sets a new record for first attempt completion," he said, his voice carefully neutral. Class dismissed. As students filed out of the hall, Rose noticed some of them looking at her differently. The sneers had been replaced by thoughtful glances and considering looks. Her success couldn't be dismissed as luck or special treatment anymore. Later that day, during a break between classes, a small group of students approached her in the cafeteria. Their leader, James, had been one of her most vocal critics in the basic combat class. "That thing you did in the simulation," he said, setting his tray down at her table. "With the corner ambush. How did you think of that?" Rose took a bite of her lunch, considering her answer. "On Colony 7, we had these predators that would hunt in packs. They'd try to surround their prey, but you could turn their hunting pattern against them if you knew how to move right." More students gathered around as she explained, asking questions about her techniques. For the first time, they weren't looking at her as an outsider, but as someone who might have something valuable to teach them. Commander Gray watched from across the cafeteria, a slight smile on his face. After the crowds dispersed, he approached Rose's table. "Congratulations," he said. "But remember, success brings its own challenges. Some people will study your techniques to learn from them. Others will study them to find weaknesses." Rose nodded, understanding the warning in his words. "Then I'll have to keep improving," she replied. That evening, as she reviewed the day's training footage on her tablet, Rose received messages from several classmates asking to train with her. The same students who had once mocked her colonial background now wanted to learn her methods. She sent polite replies, agreeing to share what she knew while being careful not to reveal all her techniques. Commander Gray had taught her well. In the academy, knowledge was power, and she was just beginning to understand how to use it. As she prepared for bed, Beth stopped by her room. "I heard about what happened in advanced training," she said. "You're becoming a legend in the basic combat class. They say you're changing how the academy thinks about combat training." Rose smiled, remembering her first day at the academy. "They haven't seen anything yet," she said, already planning her next training session. This is just the start. The academy's graduation exercises were in full swing, with thousands of spectators watching from the observation decks. Parents, military officials, and potential employers had gathered to witness the final demonstrations. Rose stood with her fellow graduating class, their uniforms pristine, waiting for their turn to showcase their skills. The first sign that something was wrong came when the station's lights flickered. At first, everyone assumed it was part of the show. Then the emergency sirens began to wail. "This is not a drill," the station's AI announced. "Unknown hostile forces have breached outer defenses. All civilians proceed to designated shelter areas. All combat-ready personnel report to defensive positions." Chaos erupted in the observation decks as civilians rushed toward the safety zones. The graduating class looked to their instructors for orders, but communications were already being jammed. Senior officers began shouting standard protocols, organizing defensive positions according to traditional station defense strategies. Rose noticed something others had missed. The attack pattern was familiar, similar to how pack predators on Colony 7 would create chaos to separate their prey. She grabbed Commander Gray's arm. "Sir, they're using our own defense protocols against us," she said urgently. "They're forcing us to cluster in standard defensive positions." The commander's eyes widened as he realized she was right. The standard response would make them easy targets. Before he could respond, the first wave of attackers breached the inner halls. "Everyone, break standard formation," Rose shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "They know our playbook. We need to adapt." Some hesitated, but many of her classmates had learned to trust her unconventional thinking. Rose quickly organized them into smaller, more mobile groups, using techniques she'd developed by combining colonial defense strategies with military tactics. "Use the high-gravity training zones," she commanded. "They won't be prepared for the pressure changes. Move like we practiced in asymmetric combat training." The attackers, expecting to find organized resistance in standard positions, instead encountered scattered groups using unpredictable tactics. Rose led her team through maintenance tunnels, using her knowledge of the station's less traveled routes to outflank the invaders. "Miller," Lieutenant Wade called out as her team successfully trapped and neutralized a group of attackers. "We can't reach Central Command. What's your assessment?" Rose quickly analyzed the situation, thinking of how predators on her homeworld would react when their initial strategy failed. "They'll try to cut off life support next," she said. "We need to split their forces." Working together, they implemented her plan. Teams of cadets used maintenance shafts and service corridors to move through the station, appearing and disappearing like ghosts, wearing down the attackers' morale and disrupting their coordination. 2 hours into the crisis, Rose's prediction proved correct. The attackers attempted to breach the life support center, but found it heavily defended by teams using her hybrid combat techniques. The tide began to turn. "Push them back toward the dock sectors," Rose commanded. "Use the variable gravity controls like we practiced. Don't let them regroup." The strategy worked. The attackers, facing resistance they couldn't predict and couldn't counter, began to retreat. Rose's classmates, many of whom had once doubted her methods, now moved with precision and confidence, executing her plans flawlessly. As the last attackers were cornered and captured, the station's lights returned to normal. A slow clap started from the observation deck. The attackers removed their masks, revealing themselves as special operations veterans. It had all been an elaborate final test. Commander Gray stepped forward, a rare smile on his face. "Cadet Miller," he announced, "you just proved why the Academy needs to evolve. Your leadership and unconventional thinking saved lives today, even in a simulation. This exercise was designed to fail using standard protocols. You proved that adaptation and innovation are just as important as tradition." Rose stood tall, her classmates gathering around her with newfound respect. She caught sight of her parents in the observation deck, tears of pride in their eyes. The farming girl from Colony 7 had not only survived the Academy, she had changed it. "Well done, Miller," Lieutenant Wade said quietly. "Well done indeed." The crisis, though simulated, had demonstrated something important. The future of military training would never be the same, and it had taken a colony farmer's daughter to show them the way. The Academy's main hall buzzed with excitement as high-ranking military officials gathered for the post-exercise briefing. Rose sat in the front row with other top performers, still processing the events of the simulated attack. Admiral Blake, head of Special Operations Command, stood at the podium, his stern face surveying the crowd. "Today's exercise," he began, "was designed to expose flaws in our traditional response protocols. What we didn't expect was to witness the birth of an entirely new combat doctrine." Holoprojectors activated, showing footage from the crisis. Rose watched as her unconventional tactics played out on the big screen. The officials leaned forward in their seats, studying the movements and strategies she had improvised. "Cadet Miller," Admiral Blake called out, "please explain your thought process during the attack." Rose stood, her voice clear and confident. "Sir, I noticed the attackers were using our own protocols against us. On my home colony, we learned that following predictable patterns made us vulnerable to predators. I applied the same principle here." "And these movement patterns," another official interrupted, "they're based on colonial defense strategies." "Yes, sir, combined with military training. The high gravity on Colony 7 taught us to be efficient with our movements. When mixed with Academy combat forms, it creates unpredictable attack patterns." The room filled with murmurs as military strategists began taking notes. Commander Gray stepped forward, addressing the assembly. "What you witnessed today was more than just quick thinking," he said. "Cadet Miller has been developing these hybrid techniques throughout her time here. Her methods challenge our basic assumptions about combat training." Lieutenant Wade, who had once dismissed Rose as colony stock, now stood to speak. "I've reviewed the combat data. Her approach resulted in 0 casualties, even in simulation. Traditional protocols predicted a 40% casualty rate in this scenario." Admiral Blake nodded thoughtfully. "Cadet Miller, do you believe these techniques can be taught to other students?" "Yes, sir," Rose answered. "In fact, many of my classmates already understand the basics. We've been practicing modified versions during training." Several of Rose's fellow cadets nodded in agreement. Even those who had once mocked her colonial background now sat straighter, proud to have learned her methods. The briefing continued for hours as Rose explained her techniques in detail. Military strategists asked questions about adapting colonial survival skills for combat situations. Training officers discussed implementing her methods into the standard curriculum. After the meeting, Commander Gray pulled Rose aside. "You've started something big," he said. "The Academy hasn't seen changes like this in decades." "I never intended to change anything," Rose replied. "I just wanted to prove I belonged here." "You did more than that," a voice said behind them. Admiral Blake approached, holding a data pad. "You've shown us that we need to broaden our perspective. The Academy has always favored traditional military backgrounds, but your success proves we've been limiting ourselves." The Admiral handed her the pad. On it was an official order. Her hybrid combat techniques were to be incorporated into the Academy's training program. She would help develop the new curriculum after graduation. Later that evening, Rose returned to her room to find it filled with messages. Training academies from other colonies wanted to learn about her methods. Military units requested briefings on her tactical innovations. Even the critics who had dismissed her as an upstart now sought her expertise. Beth burst into the room, waving her own datapad. "Rose, have you seen the official announcement? They're calling it the Miller Doctrine, a complete overhaul of combat training protocols." Rose sat on her bed, remembering her first day at the Academy. She had arrived as an outsider, a farmer's daughter that no one took seriously. Now her name would be in the training manuals, her methods taught to future generations of cadets. "Your parents are going to be so proud," Beth said softly. Rose smiled, thinking of the wheat fields of Colony 7. "They already are," she replied. "But this isn't just about me anymore. This is about changing the way we think about what makes a warrior." Commander Gray's words from her first training session echoed in her mind. The Academy needs different perspectives. She had proven him right, and in doing so, had changed the future of military training forever. The graduation ceremony of the Galactic Defense Academy had never seen such a crowd. The main hall was packed with military officials, colonial representatives, and media personnel. All eyes were on Rose Miller as she stepped up to the podium as valedictorian, her uniform adorned with the highest honors the Academy could bestow. "When I first arrived here," she began, her voice carrying across the silent hall, "I was just a farmer's daughter from Colony 7. Many thought I didn't belong. Today, I stand here not just as the top graduate, but as proof that greatness can come from anywhere." In the audience, Her parents sat with tears in their eyes. Her father, who had once worried about losing his best farmhand, now beamed with pride. Her brother Tom, who had mocked her dreams, sat speechless as his sister made history. Admiral Blake presented her with the Academy's highest honor, the Star of Excellence. "Cadet Miller," he announced, "your achievements have not only set new records, but have revolutionized our understanding of combat training. You graduate today with the highest combined scores in Academy history." After the ceremony, Rose faced a crowd of reporters and officials. Questions flew from all directions about her plans, her methods, and her future. She answered with the same quiet confidence that had carried her through the academy. "I'm establishing a new training facility," she announced. "Not in the inner systems, but on Colony 7. The announcement caused a stir. Building a premier military training facility on a farming colony was unprecedented, but Rose had her reasons. "The future of military training lies in combining different types of knowledge," she explained. "Our facility will bring together traditional military expertise with the practical wisdom of colonial life." Commander Gray, who had become one of her strongest supporters, stepped forward. "I'll be joining Instructor Miller's staff," he announced, along with several other veteran trainers who believe in her vision. Within months, the Colonial Defense Training Center rose from the fields of Colony 7. Rose ensured that the facility preserved the natural challenges of the environment. The high gravity, the unpredictable weather, the very elements that had shaped her own abilities. Students began arriving from across the galaxy. Inter-system elites trained alongside colonial farmers' children. Rose's training program combined traditional military disciplines with colonial survival skills, creating a new breed of warrior. "Watch how they move in the high gravity," she told visiting military observers. "Every challenge is an opportunity to adapt and grow stronger." Her brother Tom, who now helped manage the facility's agricultural section, often watched the training sessions. "Remember when you used to practice these moves while checking the crops?" he asked one day. Rose smiled, watching her students navigate an obstacle course she had designed based on colonial farming challenges. "Sometimes the best training ground is the one you already have," she replied. The success of her program led to a complete overhaul of military training throughout the galaxy. Other colonies began establishing their own training centers, each incorporating local knowledge and challenges into the curriculum. One evening, as the sun set over the training grounds, Rose found Beth, now her deputy instructor, watching new recruits arrive. "Look at them," Beth said. "Inter-system kids choosing to train on a colony world. You really did change everything." Rose watched as a young cadet, daughter of a wealthy inter-system family, helped a colonial farmer's son with his gear. The old barriers were breaking down, replaced by mutual respect and understanding. "The academy taught me how to be a warrior," Rose said. "But Colony 7 taught me how to be innovative. We need both to face the challenges ahead." As night fell over the facility, Rose stood at the same spot where she used to watch military ships pass overhead. Now those ships brought students to her, eager to learn the methods that had transformed military training. She had become more than just the Academy's best warrior. She had become a symbol of change, proving that excellence could come from the most unexpected places. And as she watched her students train under the stars, she knew that this was just the beginning of a new era in military history. The colony girl whom no one took seriously had become the one everyone wanted to learn from.